In the early spring of 1943, a teenage mathematics student named Janet Patricia Oakley found herself confronting one of the most devastating patterns of the Second World War. Working in a classified naval facility beneath Derby House in Liverpool, she had spent months documenting a fatal flaw in Royal Navy doctrine, a flaw that was costing thousands of lives in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. The crisis she faced was both strategic and deeply personal. Her analytical work had predicted convoy disasters with disturbing accuracy, yet senior naval leadership had consistently dismissed her findings as theoretical exercises disconnected from the realities of combat at sea. A personal tragedy amid strategic catastrophe. The telegram arrived on February 27, 1943, delivering news that would transform grief into determination. HMS Hesperus had been destroyed during operations against convoy SC-121, taking all 117 crew members to the ocean floor. Among the casualties was Janet's older brother, Thomas Oakley, who served as a destroyer officer specializing in anti-submarine operations. He was 23 years old. The circumstances surrounding the loss were particularly agonizing for Janet. Thomas had corresponded with her just weeks before his death, expressing frustration with tactical procedures that seemed ineffective against German submarine attacks. His letters described a troubling pattern. Convoys continued suffering catastrophic losses despite escorts following established operational guidelines with precision and discipline. Convoy SC-121 exemplified the strategic crisis facing Britain in early 1943. The formation had departed Halifax, Nova Scotia, on February 15th with 59 merchant vessels protected by 9 destroyer escorts arranged in conventional defensive positions. German submarine forces located the convoy on February 24th and initiated coordinated night surface attacks employing Wolfpack methodology. British escorts responded according to standard operational doctrine, pursuing attacking submarines aggressively with depth charges and illumination rounds. The engagement resulted in disaster. By February 26th, 13 merchant ships representing 72,000 tons of cargo capacity had been sent to the bottom. 6 escort vessels sustained damage, and HMS Hesperus was torpedoed while chasing a submarine that had already submerged and withdrawn from the immediate area. The destroyer fractured and sank in approximately 4 minutes, providing virtually no opportunity for crew evacuation. The Western Approaches Tactical Unit. Janet's path to this moment of crisis had begun 8 months earlier, when her mathematics aptitude led to recruitment by the Women's Royal Naval Service. Rather than assignment to conventional clerical or administrative roles, her demonstrated ability to identify complex patterns resulted in placement at a highly classified facility known as the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, commonly referred to by its abbreviated designation, Watu. The unit operated under the direction of Captain Gilbert Roberts, a retired Royal Navy officer recalled to service specifically to develop innovative approaches to the submarine warfare crisis. Roberts had conceived an unconventional methodology, full-scale floor simulations of convoy operations conducted with precise timing, accurate measurements, and mathematical rigor. The simulation space, commonly called the pit, utilized chalk markings on linoleum flooring to represent ship positions, movements, and tactical developments in real time. Roberts' approach was deliberately unorthodox. He recruited members of the Women's Royal Naval Service with no previous naval experience to serve as submarine commanders in these simulations, while experienced Royal Navy officers commanded the convoy escorts. His reasoning challenged conventional military wisdom. Officers with decades of sea service tended to repeat established patterns, their extensive experience having ingrained responses that were now proving counterproductive. Fresh analytical perspectives unburdened by doctrinal assumptions might identify vulnerabilities that experienced commanders overlooked. The theoretical foundation was sound, but faced institutional resistance. Naval tradition emphasized aggressive offensive action against enemy forces, a principle refined over 2 centuries of surface warfare against conventional fleet opponents. However, German submarines operated according to fundamentally different principles than surface vessels, and the tactical environment of 1943 bore little resemblance to previous naval conflicts. The simulation evidence. Janet's initial simulation exercises, conducted beginning July 1942, revealed a disturbing pattern with remarkable consistency. She studied captured German tactical documentation for several days, absorbing Wolfpack operational procedures, shadowing techniques, and coordination protocols for night surface attacks. When simulation exercises commenced, she commanded submarine formations against convoy escorts commanded by decorated officers with extensive combat experience. The results proved devastatingly consistent. Experienced commanders deployed escorts in wide defensive perimeters according to established doctrine, creating overlapping search zones intended to detect approaching submarines before they could achieve attack positions. Janet would observe these formations, calculate the mathematical relationships between escort positions and convoy coverage, and identify exploitable gaps.
Her submarine tactics followed a methodical pattern: deliberately expose a single submarine to draw escorts away from their assigned positions, then exploit the resulting gaps with remaining submarines that penetrated the compromised defensive screen. The approach succeeded with remarkable regularity because Royal Navy doctrine demanded aggressive pursuit of detected submarines, a response that German Wolfpack commanders had learned to anticipate and exploit. In Janet's first major simulation exercise on July 15, 1942, she faced Commander Harrison, an officer with 32 years of service, including participation in the Battle of Jutland during the First World War. Harrison deployed his 6 escort destroyers in textbook formation, protecting 40 merchant vessels. Janet maneuvered a single submarine into detection range. Harrison responded with 2 escorts breaking formation to pursue, and during their 18-minute absence, her remaining submarines penetrated the gaps and initiated attacks against the now vulnerable merchant vessels. The simulation concluded after 43 minutes with 12 merchant ships destroyed, 4 escorts damaged, and 0 submarines sunk. Harrison initially protested that the scenario lacked realism. Submarines could not possibly penetrate properly organized escort screens with such efficiency. Captain Roberts responded by presenting casualty reports from convoy ON-113, which had suffered 16 ship losses in June, despite 7 escorts employing precisely the tactics Harrison had just demonstrated in simulation. The mathematical reality of doctrinal failure. Between July 1942 and February 1943, Watu conducted 473 separate simulation exercises with varying scenarios, officer participants, convoy sizes, weather conditions, and tactical variables. The mathematical pattern remained consistent across this extensive data set. Commanders adhering to traditional aggressive pursuit doctrine consistently lost convoys, while those maintaining tight defensive formations without pursuit consistently prevented submarine penetration and protected their charges. The evidence was comprehensive, methodically documented, and mathematically rigorous. Yet the Admiralty continued dismissing these findings, with senior leadership arguing that floor simulations lacked the complexity and unpredictability of actual combat operations. Institutional resistance emphasized the value of experience and tradition over what was characterized as academic theory disconnected from operational reality. This dismissal occurred against a backdrop of mounting strategic crisis. February 1943 witnessed the loss of 63 Allied ships representing 342,000 tons of cargo capacity, with approximately 2,300 sailors killed. Statistical projections indicated that Britain would exhaust fuel reserves by July and food supplies by September if losses continued at current rates. The possibility of forced surrender without German invasion became a realistic strategic concern. The fundamental problem lay not with technology, intelligence capabilities, or resource availability, but with naval doctrine itself. The tactical principles that had served the Royal Navy effectively for generations were now facilitating enemy success. German submarine commanders had learned to predict British responses with sufficient accuracy to design tactics specifically exploiting those responses. Predictability created vulnerability, and vulnerability resulted in catastrophic losses. Forcing institutional change. The destruction of convoy SC-121 and the loss of HMS Hesperus created the circumstances necessary to overcome institutional resistance. On March 1, 1943, Janet received detailed tactical analysis of the engagement that had claimed her brother's life. The documents confirmed that escorts had followed established doctrine with precision, pursuing submarines aggressively, leaving gaps in defensive coverage, and allowing Wolfpack forces to exploit those gaps exactly as she had predicted and demonstrated in simulation exercises 8 months prior, before anyone had the opportunity to change them. She specifically requested that Admiral Max Horton, who commanded all Western Approaches operations, participate directly in a simulation exercise where she would command escorts while she employed the tactics that had destroyed SC-121. Roberts expressed skepticism that Horton, one of Britain's most decorated submarine hunters and a First World War veteran, would agree to such a demonstration, but forwarded the invitation, describing it as an opportunity to evaluate new tactical concepts developed through systematic analysis. Horton's response surprised many observers. Rather than dismissing the invitation, he expressed curiosity, despite evident skepticism about whether floor simulations could truly replicate the complexity of actual combat operations. He agreed to participate personally, stating his intention to command escorts himself to determine whether these young women could actually defeat someone with his level of experience and expertise.
Admiral Horton arrived at Derby House on morning of March 3, 1943. Following briefings on simulation methodology and mathematical modeling approaches, he took command of 8 escort destroyers protecting 50 merchant vessels under simulated mid-Atlantic winter conditions with limited visibility. Janet commanded 3 submarines, with fellow Watu member Jean Laidlaw commanding 3 additional submarines. Both had 8 months of experience identifying every weakness in standard escort doctrine and exploiting those vulnerabilities with systematic precision. Horton positioned his destroyers exactly as doctrine prescribed: wide defensive perimeter, overlapping search zones, prepared for aggressive pursuit of any detected submarine contact. Janet recognized the pattern immediately. She had observed and exploited it hundreds of times in previous simulations. The engagement commenced at 9:14 a.m. when Janet maneuvered a single submarine into visual range, deliberately exposing her position to draw escorts away from their assigned stations. Horton responded with textbook precision, dispatching 2 escorts to pursue the contact with depth charges and star shells. As Janet's submarine dove and disappeared from contact, Laidlaw's submarines moved into the gaps created by the pursuing escorts. Horton's defensive formation began fragmenting as escorts scattered pursuing contacts while attempting to maintain screen integrity. When Janet surfaced her lead submarine again in a different location, drawing another escort away, Horton attempted to cover the developing gaps while preserving some defensive cohesion. However, his adherence to established doctrine meant each pursuit created new opportunities for exploitation. Laidlaw's submarines penetrated the screen at 9:31 a.m., entering the convoy formation and initiating coordinated attacks. Horton pulled escorts back, attempting to protect the merchant vessels, but Janet's submarines had already repositioned for coordinated assault from multiple angles. The simulation concluded at 10:01 a.m., 47 minutes after commencement. 17 merchant ships had been destroyed. Horton's escorts had sunk 0 submarines. The room fell silent as Horton studied the red chalk markings representing 17 destroyed ships that would translate to approximately 1,700 casualties in actual combat. After an extended pause, Horton spoke 5 words that would fundamentally alter the Battle of the Atlantic. This works. Teach every commander. Understanding the mathematics of vulnerability. Horton spent the following 2 hours questioning Janet and Laidlaw about their methodology, how they predicted escort movements, calculated timing for gap exploitation, and coordinated attacks with such devastating effectiveness. Janet explained the mathematical foundations, pattern recognition based on doctrinal responses, timing calculations predicting where escorts would be when reacting to contacts, duration estimates for how long they would remain away from the convoy, and the mathematical certainty that those absences created penetration opportunities that could be calculated, predicted, and exploited. Horton, who had commanded submarines 3 decades earlier, understood the principles immediately from that perspective, but had never analyzed them from the convoy escort viewpoint. He had not recognized how thoroughly predictable British doctrine made escort responses, or how systematically exploitable those predictable responses had become. When Horton inquired why the Admiralty had not implemented Watu's recommendations earlier, Roberts explained the institutional resistance. Simulations were dismissed as unrealistic, and experience was valued over what senior leadership characterized as floor games. Horton asked how many convoys would fail under current doctrine based on Watu's analysis. Janet's response was unequivocal. All of them would suffer losses if escorts continued aggressive pursuit of submarines. The mathematics permitted no alternative conclusion. Janet then revealed information that provided additional context for her determination. She had conducted simulation of the SC-121 scenario 8 days before the actual convoy departed Halifax, predicting that escorts would chase submarines, that Wolfpack forces would penetrate the resulting gaps, and that approximately 13 ships would be destroyed. When Horton asked whether any Royal Navy vessels had been lost in that engagement, Janet confirmed that HMS Hesperus had been torpedoed with all hands lost, including her brother. The alternative doctrine. Janet proceeded to demonstrate the tactical alternative that Watu had developed through systematic testing, maintaining tight escort screens without pursuit, preserving formation integrity regardless of provocation, and closing gaps to create impenetrable defensive coverage. When she conducted a simulation employing these principles, escorts remained in tight formation regardless of her tactical maneuvers. They refused to break formation or pursue contacts, providing no gaps to exploit. Her submarines could not penetrate the screen, could not obtain firing solutions against merchant vessels, and could only circle uselessly outside the defensive perimeter. The simulation concluded with 0 merchant ships sunk and 0 escorts damaged, a stark contrast to the previous exercise employing traditional doctrine. The presentation continued with captured German operational reports. Laidlaw read an after-action assessment from submarine commander Gerhard Bigalk, describing Wolfpack encounters with what German commanders termed hedgehog formations, defensive screens so tightly coordinated they proved impossible to penetrate, resulting in operational failures where submarines could only shadow convoys without attacking. Horton immediately issued comprehensive orders. Every escort commander in Western approaches would receive training at Watu without exception. They would learn the new defensive doctrine, practice against Wrens employing authentic German tactics from captured documentation, lose simulations repeatedly until they understood why aggressive pursuit destroyed convoys, and implement tight defensive screens in all subsequent operations. The Mass Training Campaign. Orders went out on March 4, 1943, and within a week, officers began arriving at Derby House. Commanders with decades of combat experience and newly commissioned lieutenants fresh from training all participated in the same exercises. Sitting in the basement facility with young women with no sea service sank their convoys and explained with mathematical precision why their tactical decisions resulted in catastrophic losses.
Reception among participating officers varied considerably. Some immediately understood the analytical foundation and recognized how doctrine created vulnerabilities. Others resisted, finding it offensive that women barely out of their teenage years were teaching them naval warfare. Roberts did not argue with resistant officers. He simply conducted the simulations, allowing the mathematics to speak through repeated demonstrations. Resistant officers received intensive treatment, commanding escorts, while Janet and other Wrens employed actual German tactics from captured documents to destroy their convoys repeatedly and thoroughly. After 3 consecutive simulation massacres, most officers stopped arguing and began absorbing the lessons, recognizing that pride and tradition were less important than saving lives. Janet developed a reputation among training participants who called her the killer for her merciless simulation performance. She exploited every tactical error, punished every doctrinal decision, and destroyed convoys with surgical precision. When officers complained that her tactics were too aggressive and unrealistic, Roberts would present German casualty reports from actual convoy engagements, showing that the numbers matched Janet's simulation results with disturbing accuracy. German submarines were accomplishing in real combat exactly what Janet accomplished with chalk on a floor. The critical difference was that Janet forced officers to watch themselves fail, understand why they failed, and recognize that following doctrine meant sailors died. Tactical innovation and standardization. Between March and July 1943, Watu trained 2,500 Royal Navy officers. Every successful tactic was documented, every lesson was recorded, and every officer departed Derby House with explicit instructions for implementing defensive escort screens in their operational assignments. The tactical innovations developed at Watu received operational code names and specific implementation protocols. Raspberry addressed illumination coordination. When submarines appeared, all escorts would fire star shells in mathematically calculated patterns, providing complete perimeter coverage in 90 seconds rather than 8 minutes, eliminating shadows where submarines could operate undetected. Beta search, developed by Jean Ladow, employed mathematical prediction based on the observation that submarines shadowed convoys from positions determined by convoy speed, heading, and moon phase. Escorts would move preemptively to these calculated positions, forcing submarines to submerge or withdraw before achieving attack positions. Pineapple provided protocols for coordinated evasion against Wolfpack saturation attacks. When multiple submarines attacked simultaneously, escorts would execute overlapping zigzag patterns with continuous star shell coverage, creating interlocking fields of fire that made coordinated attacks nearly impossible to execute successfully. Step Aside, developed by Bobby House, addressed acoustic torpedo evasion. German engineers had created torpedoes that tracked propeller noise, and Step Aside employed precisely timed course changes to break acoustic lock, causing torpedoes to lose tracking before reaching targets. These tactical innovations were created by Wrens, Janet, Jean, Bobby House, June Duncan, and Margaret Roberts, who had never served at sea. They developed these approaches through thousands of simulation exercises, testing variables systematically, measuring results precisely, and refining techniques until they achieved mathematical optimization. Then they taught these tactics to officers who outranked them by decades and frequently resented learning from teenagers. Victory in the Atlantic. The operational results proved immediate and dramatic. May 1943 witnessed German submarine forces suffering their worst losses of the entire war. 41 submarines destroyed in 31 days, an event Grand Admiral Karl Donitz characterized as Black May. The submarine fleet was being systematically decimated. By June, Donitz withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic. The Wolfpack formations were shattered and convoy routes were secure. British merchant ship losses decreased by 73% between March and September. Convoys were reaching their destinations with acceptable loss rates. Supplies were arriving in Britain on schedule, and the starvation threat had been eliminated. The Atlantic War turned decisively in 4 months, not through technological advancement, not through intelligence breakthroughs from Enigma decryption, but because young women with chalk had proven mathematically that defensive escort tactics worked, while aggressive pursuit did not. Janet Oakley had transformed her brother's death into institutional change that saved the Royal Navy from a doctrine that had been killing sailors for 3 years. HMS Hesperus was never replaced, but the tactics that facilitated the convoy's destruction were abandoned. Every convoy after March 1943 employed tight defensive screens, maintained formation integrity, and did not pursue submarines into gaps. The convoys survived. Thousands of formations, carrying tens of thousands of sailors, all preserved because escorts stopped following doctrine that teenage women had proven was fatal.